It is very nice to see everybody here this morning. If you're a visitor just meeting with us for the very first time, then we encourage you to fill out a visitor's card. You can find that in a small rack in the pew in front of you at the end of our worship service. Some men will go around with a basket and collect those up. We would love to just get in contact with you and tell you how grateful we are for your presence today and to offer you any spiritual assistance that you might have. If you have questions about God, about the Bible, about our faith or the way that we conduct things here at Monte Vista, then please let us know. And we would love to sit down and open up our Bibles together with you and explain the gospel of God more clearly. Last week I mentioned a story from the book of Numbers where 12 spies were sent from the Israelites to go into the land of Canaan and spy out the land. Now only 2 of those spies came back with a good report, saying that the land is exactly what we thought it was, exactly what God said it would be. We should by all means go into the land and take possession of it just as God has commanded us. The other spies, on the other hand, came to the conclusion that the land was as good as God promised it would be, but it was also inhabited by giants. And they said, we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, thus we were grasshoppers in their sight as well. We might as well just die in the wilderness or go back to Egypt at this point. Now I want to take another angle on that story and talk about the idea of self-limitation and the way that we look at ourselves and decide in advance that we're incapable of doing something. That we are either not smart enough, or we're not strong enough, or we're not rich enough to do the things that we need to do for God. Perhaps you have felt this way at some point in your life. A feeling of intellectual inadequacy, as if I'm really never going to be capable of knowing enough to be a strong Christian. There's just so many people who know the Bible better than I do. They can quote Bible verses and they seem to understand the difficult concepts a little bit more than I do. I guess I'm just never going to be smart enough to be that strong of a Christian. Perhaps you feel frustration over a limited set of talents or an inability to learn something new, that you want to do more for God, but every time you try, it just blows up in your face, and you prove just how untalented you really are. Maybe you've repeatedly sabotaged your relationships with a spouse or your children or other Christians. Maybe you've done things to sour your relationship with the elders of this congregation, and that has limited, at least in your mind, your ability to participate and be an active Christian. Maybe there's a desire to be more charitable, but you lack the resources to accomplish anything that you think or perceive to be a meaningful contribution to those who have a need. Or maybe there's a feeling of unworthiness about our blessings to the point that guilt has paralyzed any ability to feel secure about salvation or forgiveness. Or maybe there's just the good old fear that I'll never be strong enough to defeat my demons. You might suffer from the feeling of inadequacy, and that is perfectly normal. We all go through it at times. And in a sense, as we'll see here in the lesson in just a moment, there is a sense of inadequacy that we must feel before we truly come to Christ as we are and get built up into the people that He wants us to be. You and I can never do it on our own. You and I will never be strong enough to overcome sin without the change that happens in Jesus Christ. We will never be clever enough or smart enough to know all of life's difficult answers to the difficult questions apart from God. And without God, you'll never really know the meaning of life or where all of this came from or what is the eternal outcome of all things. You're never going to be good enough to earn heaven. I will never be good enough to earn heaven. Nothing that we can do can cause us to earn our place in heaven. And you know that you're never going to be rich enough to fix all of the world's problems. No matter how rich you are, there is no amount of money that can fix everything wrong with a world that has been broken by sin. So yes, if you're feeling inadequate, then I suppose you're in great company. So where does a feeling of adequacy come from? Please turn with me to the book of 1 Corinthians. And let's notice something here. From Paul's letter here in 1 Corinthians, and let's actually go ahead and go in 2 Corinthians. Sorry, I wrote 1 Corinthians, but we'll go 2 Corinthians there. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, let's pick up here in verse 1 and read this together. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, as some, letters of commendation to you or from you? You are our letter, written in our hearts, known and read by all men, being manifested that you are a letter of Christ, cared for by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. What Paul is introducing to the Corinthians here in 2 Corinthians 3 is the idea that we cannot be adequate because of the works that we do just on our own merit. There's no letter I can write, no letter of recommendation, no commendation from another human being that makes me worthy or makes me adequate the way that God can. And that's kind of what Paul is saying to the Corinthians. Do you really think that we need anybody's commendation? Do we need anybody's approval but God's approval? Does anything make us worthy apart from what God does to us? And that's his reference there in verse 3, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of living hearts. The tablets of stone there is the law, works of the law, works of merit. You can't earn it. You are inadequate. You are inadequate until Jesus does something to you. And that's where we pick up here in the next section of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, beginning in verse 4. And such confidence we have through Christ toward God. Because you might think, based on some of the other things that Paul wrote, calling himself the greatest of all sinners, or the least of all the saints in 1 Corinthians 15, constantly reminding the people around him what a sinner he was, and how he was a persecutor of the church, and how he hated Christ and hated Christians and tried to destroy them. And he never shied away from that part of his life. He even used that part of his life as the basis for some of his arguments in the book of Acts in chapter 22 or in 26. He never shied away, but you might think, based on some of the other things that Paul said, that Paul must have had a very low sense of self-esteem. And yet here he is saying, such confidence we have through Christ toward our God. Confidence. A man who acknowledged his sinfulness and his ultimate unworthiness to be a servant in the kingdom says, I have confidence. But in what? Verse 5. Not that we are adequate in ourselves. That's the key to this passage, isn't it? Not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant, not of the letter or of the law, again, works of merit, things we do to deserve it, but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. When he talks about Spirit, he means the new covenant in general, the spiritual covenant, the way of the Spirit versus the way of the flesh or the way of the law. But in verse 7, if the ministry of death in letters engraved on stones came with glory so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because of the glory of his face fading as it was, how shall the ministry of the Spirit fail to be even more with glory? Moses had to put a veil over his face every time he went to talk to God because he would come back, his face would be shining bright and people couldn't even look at him. So he had to put a veil over it to obscure the brightness. And what Paul is saying is, if the glory of that law, the law of Moses, was that glorious, and it was a fading glory, it was a temporary glory, how much more is the glory to be found in Jesus Christ and His covenant? Verse 9, for if the ministry of condemnation has glory, how much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory? For indeed, what had glory in this case has no glory on account of the glory that surpasses it. For if that which fades away was with glory, how much more that which remains is in glory? And so he concludes with a bookend here in verse 12, so to speak. You might also see it as a transition into the rest of the chapter, but I'll use it as a bookend to prove my point. He says in verse 12, having therefore such a hope, We use great boldness in our speech. That's where the confidence comes from. If you thought there was glory to be found in the law of Moses, and let's sum that up by saying glory to be found in works that we do, merit, law, flesh, if that has even a little bit of glory, compared to the glory of the Spirit, the glory of the covenant of Christ, it's nothing. It's nothing. And that's why we have confidence. I don't have confidence in myself, like I'm adequate enough just by myself, like I'm strong enough to do everything that's presented to me, to face every challenge, like I'm smart enough to outwit everybody around me and figure things out without the Word of God to shed light on the matter. Or like I'm ever going to be rich enough to just solve all the world's problems. I'll fix world hunger, and we'll get cancer cured, and we'll deal with fighting oppression around the world and injustice. And let's go ahead and repave all the streets while we're at it, because those are terrible too. And no amount of money is going to fix all the world's problems. But when I step into the light of the gospel, I become so glorious with an unfading glory, not derived from myself, but derived from the light of Jesus Christ. And that's very empowering, isn't it, my friends? Now, there's certainly more to be said to address our feelings of limitation and inadequacy, but this must be the foundation upon which all other points are built, that you are not adequate by yourself. So how do I cope with my limitations then? You might be wondering why I've had a mouse on the screen the whole time. Because usually I try to find something visual that matches up with the lesson. And so far it's probably drawing a blank. Well, in Aesop's fables there's one story about a mouse and a lion, and I'll read it for you. A lion lay asleep in the forest, his great head resting on his paws. A timid little mouse came upon him unexpectedly, and in her fright and haste to get away, ran across the lion's nose. Roused from his nap, the lion laid his huge paw angrily on the tiny creature to kill her. "Spare me," begged the poor mouse. "Please let me go, and someday I will surely repay you." The lion was much amused to think that a mouse could ever help him, but he was generous and decided to let the mouse go. Some days later, while stalking his prey in the forest, the lion was caught in the toils of a hunter's net. Unable to free himself, he filled the forest with his angry roaring. Now the mouse knew the voice and quickly found the lion struggling in the net. Running to one of the great ropes that bound him, she gnawed it until it parted, and soon the lion was free. "You laughed when I said I would repay you," said the mouse. "Now you see that even a mouse can help a lion." Now maybe you're just a mouse, at least in your own estimation. Or maybe you think that you're a lion in your own estimation. The fact is, you are what you are. You are what you are. I know that there are ways that we can make ourselves stronger through exercise or self-discipline, and we can certainly gain more knowledge through study. We can learn wisdom along the way, and we can earn more money and put it into service. I understand all of those things, but in a sense, you are what you are, and God has given you a certain set of talents, a certain set of skills. He has made you with strengths, and He has also made you with weaknesses, and perhaps you are a mouse. But the funny thing is, even a mouse can find a way to help a lion. When a mouse realizes it doesn't need to be anything more than what it is. So I want to look at three kinds of limitations with the rest of our lesson. Three kinds of limitations that we believe we're stuck with. The first is that I'm not talented enough to serve God as I should. The second is that I'm not rich enough to serve God as I should. And the third is that I am not smart enough to serve God as I should. We will begin with talents then. Sometimes what we think is a limitation as far as our talents goes is just a misplaced desire for a talent that we're not even meant to have in the first place. You are what you are. You have a set of talents that can be put into service, and God gave you the talents for a reason. Turn to Matthew chapter 25. I'm sure you know where we're going with this. There's a great parable that Jesus told in Matthew chapter 25, beginning in verse 14. It is just like a man about to go on a journey who called his own servants and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2 talents, and to another just 1, each according to his own ability, and he went away on his journey. Each according to his own ability. Now, did he fault the 1-talent man for only having the ability to manage 1 talent? No, certainly not. And when he came home, if the 1-talent man had simply said, I took your 1 talent, I did the best that I could with it, and here's the return for my labors, he would have been just as pleased with the 1-talent man as he was with the 5-talent man or the 2-talent man, the way that they used their talents to the best of their abilities. Now here's the funny thing that we don't always think about with the 1-talent man. We assume that the man was given 1 talent and that it was a measly talent. And I know it's a bit of a play on words, isn't it? A talent was a unit of money in their time period, but it's a kind of a play on words now, the way we use the word talent today. What if you have just 1 talent, but it's a really big talent? What if you have 1 talent and it's a talent that can make a really big difference in people's lives? What if you have just 1 talent, but properly utilized, that 1 talent will give you enough to do for a lifetime of Christian service? So what if you have just 1 talent? Take your 1 talent and use it. And I guarantee that if God only gave you 1 talent, He gave you 1 talent for a reason. Some talents are very important talents. And some talents are big enough to manage, just as 1 talent. Now, the person with 5 talents, that doesn't mean his workload was really all that much bigger. Now, again, I mean this, we have a play on words with the word talent today, and I understand that this is a unit of money in Matthew 25 that we're talking about. But imagine in our modern day setting, let's say you did have 5 talents, but they were 5 smaller talents. That doesn't necessarily mean your workload is bigger, or that you're more important, or that you're more talented. It simply means that you have the ability to manage 5 smaller talents. Some people can juggle 1 thing. That's me. I can juggle 1 thing. You know how you used to take like the little handkerchiefs in elementary school and you have to try to figure out, I could take 1 and throw it in the air. I can juggle 1 thing. Some people can juggle 5 things. If you go to the circus, there are people who can juggle a dozen things probably. But if your 1 talent is your 1 talent, the only thing God expects you to do is use your 1 talent. The master in this parable didn't fault the 1-talent man for only having the ability to use 1 talent. He just gave him the 1 talent that he knew could be put into his service. The master was unimpressed with the 1-talent man, not because he had just 1, but because he failed to appreciate it and utilize it. Every now and then on the internet you come across a funny meme. We all love a funny meme, don't we? Someone with a funny picture and a really punctuated point at the end of it, give you a chuckle in the middle of your day. There's these memes that go around called, "You only had 1 job to do." And it's things like putting a toilet seat on backwards. You take a picture. You had 1 job to do, right? You had 1 job to do. Or when they paint lines or words onto a road, like the word bump, right? There's a speed bump ahead. And you spelled it out B-M-U-P. You had 1 job to do, right? That's the same with the 1 talent, isn't it? If you have 1 talent, focus on your 1 talent. What ends up happening, though, with 1-talent people is they're so focused on the 5-talent man over here and the 2-talent man over there, they look at other people's talents and say, "Oh, I wish I could do that. I sure wish I was better at that. Look at him, he gets all the attention, and I'm over here." And what ends up happening is you're not paying attention to the steering wheel. And you drive your 1-talent car into a stop sign. If you focus on your 1 talent, and utilize it and appreciate it. You can do great things for God, my friends. You can do great things for God. We're all very familiar with 1 Corinthians chapter 12 as well. Beginning in verse 14, Paul describes the way that the human body has members, right? Body parts, the hand, the feet, the eyes, the nose, etc. And all of these members have individual talents. They bring something to the table. And together they make up a fully functioning human body. But what was to happen if the eyes looked down at the feet and became jealous of their job? Or if the feet looked up at the head and said, I wish I could do what the head could do? What if the ears got tired of being ears and admired the way the hands are so versatile and useful? Right? The hands, that's the 10 talent man right there. I mean, your hands can do a lot of things. With the same hand, we can chop wood, we can wield any kind of implement or tool, we can perform brain surgery, we can type on a computer, we can paint a painting. Our hands can do a lot of things, but you know what your hands can't do? They can't taste food. So it's interesting, isn't it, that with our hands, we can craft incredible and intricate things, but we can't taste food with our hands. Our eyes are amazing as well. Our eyes are the greatest cameras in all of history. There is no camera that can replicate what the eyes can do just by God's plain design. But you know what your eyes can't do? Your eyes are completely incapable of getting from point A to point B. Now you can look at point B, can't you? But you can't get there with your eyes. Now maybe you just have one talent or two or 5 or 10 or however many talents. If you're a foot, you're a foot. If you're an eye, you're an eye. Be so grateful that God has found something for you to do in His kingdom at all. That there is a place for each and every one of us. Each and every one of us, from the pinky toe to the earlobe, that there's a place for each and every one of us is a blessing just by itself. And let us be grateful for that and be empowered, not by our sense of what we wish we could do, but empowered by the talents that God has already given to us. But then there's money. I just don't feel like I'm doing as much as I should be doing. I just don't have the money to be as charitable or as hospitable as I could be. I just wish that I could do more. Well, I will say the wishing is good, and I'm glad that there's wishing. Without the desire to do more, I highly doubt that you ever would or could do more. But I like the way Paul describes it to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Let's read together verses 1 through 5. Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God which has been given in the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. Look at that. They're rich in joy, but poor in everything else. Their abundance of joy and their deep poverty. These are people who simply do not have the financial resources to do all the things that maybe they wish they could. I wish we could feed more people. I wish we could clothe more people. I wish we could do more. They don't have the money, but you know what they do have? Eagerness, desire, the joy to serve. They're earnest. He says in verse 3, for I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much entreaty for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. And this, not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. Now skip on down to verses 11 and 12 and notice what he has to say here. But now finish doing it also, and that's to the Corinthians, by the way. Finish doing it also, that just as there was the readiness to desire it, so there may be also the completion of it by your, what's the word there? By your ability. For if the readiness is present, it is acceptable according to what a man has, not according to what he does not have. Now, I think the Macedonians provide a great example. First of all, what the Macedonians did was they looked at their deep poverty and they thought we can either make an excuse about it or we can simply accept it for what it is. Now, sometimes we kind of draw a line and say, well, this is as far as I can go. This is as much hospitality as I can afford. This is as much charity as I can afford. But that line has just been invented. It's a fabricated line. Because we don't want to pay a little bit less this month for some luxury item, we've decided that we can't share more with somebody who has need. So it really just boils down to perception, doesn't it? I don't think I have enough to give. I don't think I have enough to give. But the Macedonians said, you know what? We probably don't have enough to give. We probably shouldn't give this much, but we're going to anyway. We're going to anyway because our joy pushes us. Our joy drives us to give and to give and to give some more. And that's what Paul says. They gave to their ability and even beyond their ability. And it was more than we expected from them. Far more than we expected from them. But to the Corinthians, he does remind them, give as you have ability. If you have the ability to give, then give. But you can't give more than what you have. Give to your ability. Jesus told the story of a poor widow who came into the temple to offer her alms. And she threw in a couple of copper coins, which was all she had, by the way. It's all she had. And there were others who were filing into the temple who had plenty of money. And they, out of their abundance, were simply giving a pittance. Now, in total, what they give was much more than what the poor widow gave. In total, in sheer number, it was more. But Jesus reminded his listeners that she gave out of her poverty, and they gave out of their abundance. And because of that, she actually gave more than they did. I know it can be hard not to have as much money as you wish you did. I have a decent life, and I'm not going to complain about it. But there's always things that I wish I could afford. There's things I wish I could participate in, things that need to get done in this world that I wish I had the money to help out with. There's a lot of people that need help, and I can't help everybody, and neither can you. And neither can you. Be satisfied with what you can do, though. Be satisfied with what you can do. But the most difficult point I'm going to make today is on this. Are you ever going to be smart enough? Smart enough to be the Christian that you ought to be, smart enough to serve God as you should, smart enough to finally understand what everybody else seems to have gotten a long time ago. One aspect of knowing God is that it is an intellectual pursuit. So let's acknowledge that first of all. It is an intellectual pursuit to know God. In Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 4, the apostle presented information. He presented evidence to his listeners, and his listeners were expected to weigh the evidence and come to an intellectual decision on whether they were going to accept the gospel or not. That's part of it. Paul said in Ephesians 3, verse 4, that when you read, you understand my insight into the mystery of Christ. And faith is built up by hearing the word of Christ in Romans 10 and verse 17. So to be sure, there is something to knowledge and intelligence and study. But pure knowledge is not the end game. And if we fooled ourselves into thinking that, then we are sadly mistaken. If you read Ephesians chapter 3 and you come to the conclusion that when you read, you understand my insight in the mystery of Christ, and you say, well, I'm just not very smart. I have a hard time reading. I have a learning disability. I just can't read everything in the Bible and understand it. You might quit reading Ephesians 3, and you might not ever get to verse 14. You might not ever get to verse 14, where he admits that knowledge isn't the be-all, end-all of being a Christian. Yes, you've got to have knowledge, and you've got to learn and study and grow in that regard. But he says, I bow my knees before the Father. And in verse 15, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God. Knowledge is one part of it. But Paul says there's a bigger part, a deeper part, and that's accessible to everybody. And if you're just not that smart, God can work with that. Because the love of Christ and the power of the gospel, as he says here, surpasses knowledge. Something bigger than just mere knowledge is at work in your life when the gospel becomes a part of who you are. Remember how diverse the early church was. The earliest disciples were blue-collar fishermen from Galilee. They were tax collectors. One of them was a political extremist. The gospel appealed to Greek intellectuals in Acts 17, verse 34, to Roman officials in chapter 13, verse 12, to former priests in chapter 6, verse 7, to beggars in chapter 3, verse 8, to men and women from every social class. The gospel appealed to them all. So a few applications as we bring our lesson to a close. If you love the truth, you will know it to the extent that you can, and that is enough to please God. Jesus says it is the truth that will set you free. And quite frankly, Mark 16, verse 16 doesn't take rocket science to understand. And if you can understand Mark 16, 16, well, you know enough to be saved, my friend. You know enough to be saved. In the 2 Thessalonian letter in chapter 2, verses 10 through 12, Paul makes it clear that the reason why some people fail to truly understand the gospel is because they don't have a love for the truth. That's what it boils down to, is they don't love the truth. And because they don't love the truth, they'll never get it. No matter how smart they are, they'll never get it because they don't love the truth. And if you love the truth, I'll say it again, God can work with that. Keep pursuing even if you don't believe that you're smart enough to learn anything new, because I will tell you, you will surprise yourself. Maybe it'll take a few years, but you will surprise yourself at what you know. Don't compare yourself to anybody else. Remember, there are brilliant minds that have failed to grasp even basic theological concepts. Paul went to Athens, the smartest city on earth in its time, and he presented the gospel to them, a very simple gospel message, by the way, that there is one supreme creator God who is over all mankind. He has communicated with mankind and asked us to repent of our sins. That is the gospel message diluted so simply that anybody should have accepted it. And yet the people of Athens were too smart for their own good. And as soon as Paul said something about the resurrection, they sneered at him and walked away. The brilliant minds of Paul's time couldn't understand the gospel. Salvation is not based on how smart you are, and neither is your usefulness to God. I don't imagine Peter was a very educated man, nor James or John. They were fishermen from Galilee. And I know that I'm pressing upon them a bit of a stereotype for their time period, but I just find it hard to believe that a blue-collar fisherman from Galilee, which was the podunk of its time period, was really all that educated. But in Matthew 16, when Jesus asked Peter and his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" I know what the other people say. I know they say I'm a prophet or I'm Elijah or something else. Who do you say that I am? And Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus patted him on the shoulder and said, "You got it." A blue-collar fisherman got it, when the smartest people of his time period couldn't understand the basics. Take it slow and start small. The Ethiopian eunuch, for example, in Acts chapter 8, he knew enough to be saved. He had Isaiah 53. What a blessing it is that you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and Ephesians. What a blessing it is. He had Isaiah 53 and said, "What prevents me from being baptized?" You have the entire New Testament and the entire Old Testament as a witness to the glory of the Messiah. You have so much at your disposal. The Ethiopian eunuch started small and he knew enough to be saved. And if I read Mark 16:16 one more time, then you know enough to be saved as well. Because he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. So I encourage you at this time, whatever spiritual need you have, let it be known by coming forward as we stand and sing.